Hi again, everybody, and welcome to the Allstream building here on the grounds of the Canadian National Exhibition. We're at MESH, Canada's web conference, and joining us now for our debate, Tony Clement, the newly shuffled President of the Treasury Board and Conservative Member of Parliament for Parry Sound Muskoka. Charlie Angus, NDP Member of Parliament for Timmins James Bay. Wilf Dinnick, Founding Editor and CEO of OpenFile. Mika Sifry, co-founder and editor of the Personal Democracy Forum and author of WikiLeaks and the Age of Transparency, and Jesse Brown, host of TVO's own Search Engine podcast. For those of you watching us from home, we'd like you to get involved in the program as well. You can send us a tweet, twitter.com. The hashtag is your agenda. We're live streaming this program on our webpage. That's tvo.org/theagenda, where our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, is moderating an online chat. So tvo.org/theagenda. Dial us up. Weigh in with your views throughout the course of the broadcast. And for those of you who are watching here in the hall, you'll notice we have a screen up here, and everything that is hashtag your agenda, you'll be able to catch the comments that I hope you're tweeting back there. And let's just put it out there. You guys can tweet as well. You five who are guests on the program. I know you're all inveterate tweeters, so if you're not answering questions, feel free to pull out, as you are right now, and send a tweet. That's A-OK. Well, let me first of all, Tony Clement, congratulations on your personal re-election, your new position in Cabinet. Same to you.
Thank you.
My good friend from way back when at TVO. You and I used to do TV together in the analog days, and now you're a member of Her Majesty's Loyal Official Opposition.
Yes, indeed. Imagine
Incredible.
that.
Okay, congrats to you too. I want to take you both back, all of you back, in fact, to the end of March. You'll remember this well. Your government, Tony Clement, was defeated on the floor of the House of Commons, and Bill Curry in the Globe and Mail had this to say within a couple of days. The defeat of the Conservative government unleashed a torrent of political tweets. By mid-afternoon Sunday, more than 14,000 tweets had been sent out during the first day and a half of the campaign related to the election or Canadian politics. With a potential reach of more than 16 million people, it was a dramatic spike from the less than 2,000 tweets on the same topics the weekend before. If there was ever a question before, it's clear now. Canada's first social media election is underway. Let's start there. Tony Clement, how much of a role do you think social media played in your personal campaign, in your riding?
I would say fairly limited. And I would say that because still the level of engagement when you break it down at a riding level is going to be several hundred, maybe a couple of thousand out of a whole universe of potentially 70,000 voters. So it's not going to be the be-all and the end-all, although I did use Twitter quite extensively during my campaign to tell people where I was going or where I had just been.
Do you think it made a difference?
I'm fairly skeptical about social media during the last election campaign. I think that it was hyped up, and I think that there was an amount of engagement, but a lot of the engagement was a lot of people yelling at each other. And I'm not sure that I didn't know what to expect, but I certainly didn't expect the uber partisanship that was shown on a social media site like Twitter. Twitter is known to be a bit of an echo chamber at the best of times, but this kind of took it to another level. So I think this is still something that's in process. I don't think we're necessarily at the end point yet, but I got to say I was disappointed with the amount of maturity and the amount of real engagement that was able to be done.
Okay. Charlie, how about you in Northern Ontario?
I think new media played a huge role on the ground, and I think in the national campaign. I agree with Tony about the thing on Twitter. I've been teasing Tony. I think it's an echo chamber and 140 characters. I'm not all that impressed at its ability. It probably can do stuff, but what impressed me was Facebook. And Facebook, the ability at the national level where people, Steve, everybody wrote the New Democrats off. Every editorial writer in the country, now they're scratching their heads and saying, what the heck happened? I saw on Facebook how people were deconstructing the media and passing their own stories, and people were starting their own conversations. So you have the hyper partisanship in the Twitter realm, but in Facebook where people are creating their own friends groups and that and talking and then starting to encourage each other as the orange wave happened. I'm not going to say it happened because of Facebook, but it helped it. On the ground in my riding, I saw some fascinating changes. For example, a riding like mine where I've got 6 to 8 communities where there's no roads. Isolated First Nation.
You should just explain. There are a lot of people probably watching this, who don't know where your riding is. You're from Cobalt.
Yeah. Timmins James Bay. It's bigger than Great Britain. So the northern half of my riding, Cree communities, Saskatchewan, Fort Albany, Moose Factory, Attawapiskat, it is impossible to do political outreach into those communities unless you fly in. Try phoning, it's not going to work. There's no way you could normally do that. We used Facebook. Everybody in those communities are on Facebook. They talk to each other on Facebook. It's how these isolated Cree communities are speaking to each other. So we started to see them talking about us on Facebook and saying, get out the vote, come on. You know, Charlie's been in the community. Come on, folks, get out the vote. So did it change the election? No. But I think the potential for people to organize themselves is really fascinating.
Wilf, was this the first social media election in as big a way as some have reported?
No, I thought it was I was totally disappointed. You know, you look at the Facebook fan pages for the parties, and the pennants, there's like hardly any people on there. I mean, it was 20,000 for the Conservatives, and 15,000 for the NDP. And they could have used it in such a bigger way, in such a better way, especially around the issues. And I would say that Tony, especially, is probably on the Hill at least one of the better people who uses Twitter in a better way. It's a place where passion and personality comes out, and that's really important. And the politicians, most of them were using them as a press release tool. Mm-hmm. You could see the semantics, the way that it was written was the same thing you'd see on a press release. And I mean, that's not what that's for. You do that another way. So I found that yeah, it was the first time we had the opportunity to use social media, but boy, did everyone drop the ball.
Just following up on that, I don't know the musical tastes of any of the cabinet ministers of the Harper government except his. I know he likes Arcade Fire.
Did you check out Radio 3? I was on there. Come on.
Okay, sorry about that.
And I had Arcade Fire before you, I think.
There we go.
Jesse, how about it? Was this the first social media election?
This was not the first social media election. It was a wasted opportunity, I think. And I think that blame has to be shared. On the one hand, we saw the parties just fail to engage in meaningful ways. Perhaps present company excluded this is not a medium for issuing press releases, it's a medium for engagement and conversation. We don't measure this stuff. We shouldn't measure this stuff in terms of how many tweets were released or how many friends are on a Facebook page. The promise of this, what we're trying to achieve here, is a more engaged process, a more engaged democracy. We're looking for things like the creative exuberance that happened in the States when people took it upon themselves to make their own campaign videos and songs. We're looking for people to fact-check politicians. We're looking for people to have really substantive debates about what was happening. There were really pressing issues that I didn't see the public really engaging with directly, and I didn't see the parties encouraging them to. But there was a huge disconnect because at the same time, Canadians were engaging on issues that we don't necessarily think of as political, but more as digital policy or consumer issues. So people, almost 500,000 Canadians recently, just shortly before the election, signed a petition against usage-based billing. Is that a completely disconnected phenomenon from this other sphere where Canadians are not engaging? Is there some way of connecting that? And I think that there was a hesitancy on the part of the parties to really try to tap into that. And what I asked was, doesn't anyone want the geek vote? No one seemed to.
No one seemed to. Mika, you obviously have the American experience much closer to heart, and based on what you've heard here about where we may have been underwhelming on the social media front, what are we missing out on that you're doing down there?
Well, first of all, I kind of think you're asking the wrong question because...
That's not the first time people have said that to me.
Well, with all due respect. It's an important question, but it isn't just, as Jesse was alluding, the rise of social media, or our I would call it the age of mass participation, which is really what we're entering, that anybody can enter the public conversation if they want to now. The barriers are down, the gatekeepers are gone, is what happens next. And what I was hearing was that from the political side, this is unnerving, because it disrupts the normal way that people have grown up, used to having engaging the public, which has largely been in the control of the politicians and the parties. And that control is disappearing, and so, if it's not as polite a conversation as we're having now, we have to live with that and adapt to it, not just sort of wring our hands and wish it would go away. It's not going to go away. What we learned from the United States, and I think in 2008, we have to recognize that it was an exceptional election, and what's going to happen in 2012 will not be the same. That was a change election. There was a pent-up demand to end 8 years of the Republicans controlling the White House, and we had a candidate who was very much in tune with that desire for change in Barack Obama. And so a lot of people got themselves off their couches and decided to participate even without asking for permission or doing it through the campaign's channels, Facebook and so on. This time around is going to be different. People are not as passionate. To go to Jesse's point, these tools they're neutral. They get exciting when people have a reason to be excited about politics. If there's something that is engaging them, a candidate or a message that really resonates, then we'll see social media matter. If we're going to hear the same old, people are not going to plug in this new way in the same way that they didn't plug in the old way.
Let me just do a little business here, just to remind our viewers, we're at the MESH conference in downtown Toronto, right by the waterfront on the grounds of the Canadian National Exhibition. And we're talking about social media, how influential they were in the previous election campaign of May the 2nd. And then we'll look forward in a few minutes' time at things like the Arab Spring and talk about how influential they were. Please tweet. Please send us your views. Twitter.com, #YourAgenda. We should also let you know that we're here in the middle of the conference. So there's the board that shows your tweets coming in, #YourAgenda. We should also say that our audience is somewhat in flux because people are coming from and going to other sessions that are taking place here at the conference. So if it looks a little busy behind me, that's why. Tony Clement, I want to follow up with you on this because it is true. Most politicians seem to use Twitter to put out these mind-numbingly boring, irrelevant statements about what their wonderful departments just did. You don't do that, and you get actually a lot of kudos for being accessible to people and for tweeting stuff that's different than that. What I want to know is, your Prime Minister in particular, and your government in general, is known for being extremely tight with information. There was a time you wouldn't even tell us where cabinet meetings were happening. How much hell are you getting into for all of this, what seems to be off-message tweeting that you do?
Well, look, so far I haven't been fired, so that's a good sign. But in all honesty, I think that I did have the conversation with the Prime Minister's office as I was starting to get engaged in Twitter. And I said, look, just to be sure and fair about this, I'm going to be engaging in this. And the point is, we have to do this. And in order to engage the citizenry in the 21st century, we have to be experts at this. We have to be better than what we're doing right now on Twitter and other forms of social media. So I'm going to try some things out, and I said to them, and I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to mess up somewhere along the line, but you know what? As a politician, I can mess up in sending out an email. I can mess up in a speech that I do. I can mess up at the grocery store when I say the wrong thing in the wrong way.
Okay, what's the biggest train wreck you've had so far?
Well, but you know, what I would say that a couple of the things were a bit too whimsical, and a couple of the things were a bit too serious in terms of the elevation of the debate got a little bit too over the top. So I've done both extremes. But the fact of the matter is, I said to the Prime Minister's office, I said, look, we have to learn, and we're going to make mistakes as we learn. And they said, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. Go to it, and let's all learn together.
Charlie, you're now the official opposition.
Yes.
You're not this small rump in the corner of the House of Commons that can sort of say anything and do anything, and people don't care as much. They will care more now. Do you have to be more careful about what you tweet?
Well, I don't want to be off message here, but I think tweeting tends to be generally moronic. I barely ever look at tweeting because, you know, it's all people's, like, the 140 characters all arguing to themselves. So I just don't waste much time on it. I don't think it gets us anywhere. I read some of Tony's, and it's great that you got beaver tails in Davos, but I don't really, you know, it makes Tony likable, but to me it's not political involvement. I choose Facebook because I think it's a way of building community where people can start a conversation. I post articles, I post music. It's my own personal page, and if you act outrageous, I kick you off. But what I think is important is about getting communities to talk to each other, because Tony's right about the whole digital troll thing, and I think we've got to break through that.
For those who don't know, digital trolls are what?
Well, the digital trolls who hang around at the end of articles just trashing you with whatever the latest partisan thing. Like, if that's the level of digital involvement, then we aren't citizens. So we have to get beyond that. It's hyper-partisan. We've got to find ways of creating conversations and letting people do it, not having us politicians try and dominate it.
No, but let me be the defender of Twitter just for a second.
Go ahead, Charlie.
On this point, because you are raising some valid concerns.
They're just trashing me now, Tony.
But I would say this, though. I would say this about Twitter. Twitter is only as good as the type of people who are engaging in the conversation. So you have good people and bad people, informed people and uninformed people. But there is, I will say this, when you take away the experience in the 37-day election 41 writ period, which was just, in my view, over the top, But generally on Twitter, you do get a range of opinion, and you do get people defending people who are willing to engage, even if they are not engaging on their particular point of view. And I've been defended by people who are not conservative, who are the antithesis of conservatives, simply because I'm willing to engage and I'm willing to answer questions and I'm willing to rough it up in the rough and tumble world of Twitter. So there are people who want to see that level of debate and discussion, and let's not forget that that's on Twitter as well.
Since Charlie's put it out there, Mika, I'll get to you in a second. Michael, let me call a bit of an audible here. Take a wide shot of the hall. Okay. Can I see a show of hands here? How many people agree with Charlie Angus that most of what happens on Twitter is a giant waste of time? Hands up. Hands down. How many people think it can really be useful and it's a good thing? Hands up. Well, there's a shit.
Can I go
Charlie,
further
you
out
don't,
on the? I want to get further out onto the thin ice.
Go ahead.
What I want to really say is that I
Way to
look
know
at all
your
these,
audience here,
I look
Charlie.
at all these politicians with gray hair, and they're thinking, Twitter, man, we got to get into the Tweeterverse, and so they're like, boy, should I walk to work? Should I have cornflakes for breakfast? You know, like I really don't care. And I think that's the danger, and that's why I like to go at Twitter, because being on Twitter doesn't make you cool, and politicians need to understand that. They have to have something to say.
No, they do.
wherever they do.
But they have to have.
You just said that it's moronic.
Yeah.
Not that it was a waste of time, but that it's moronic.
Oh, I said it often is moronic.
Well, good enough.
Yeah.
And
you should see some of Tony and my colleagues.
I don't want to spend our whole hour discussing the pluses and minuses of Twitter. It's just one form of social media. But that you're betraying a surprising level of condescension and ignorance about how people are using a tool like Twitter for all kinds of social benefit. I mean,
no, I'm saying about politicians using it.
Politicians, some politicians are morons. It's true, but that doesn't.
I didn't mean you dear people are morons, but I did mean the way it's being used in a parliamentary session.
No, I using it. The fact is, we're watching people experiment and try and figure out smart ways of using it, and I would think it best to keep a more open mind. Rather than just sort of issue a blanket statement like that.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Charlie, I welcome every politician who wants to look cool by entering the Tweeterverse, because when they set foot there and start talking about their wonderful programs or the cornflakes they had, they need to be accessible. And as soon as they set foot on that platform, they are open to, as a journalist or professional internet troll, I can immediately call them out for questions. I'm asking questions in front of an audience. And it's very difficult once you've said, I want to be here with the people having this big conversation, to be so open and accessible, for you to then ignore anyone who challenges you. So anyone who wants to be a man of the people might get challenged by the people. And Twitter, I hope that more people, through whatever foolhardy notions they have about how hip it'll make them, please stumble onto Twitter. I'm waiting for you.
Well, what do you think about Facebook, though? Because Facebook is where people create their own conversations. And again, I'm not anti-Twitter, but I think that politicians have adopted social media as a way of being relevant, when the way to be relevant is to have something to say. So, and to have something to say is to engage people, and that's what's changing. Press releases are useless. I don't ever put a press release on Facebook because I'm going to alienate people, because it's like, if I wanted a press release, I would have gone to your website. Websites are history. So how do we engage people? That's the conversation. And I think the problem in the political realm is we get we're looking for the latest things so that the politicians will be in some kind of fad, when the important thing is developing that conversation. So if you're doing it with Twitter, I love what Tony does on Twitter. I just would rather do it on Facebook.
Let's hear from Will.
But I just find it really surprising that even when we look at Tony, who really is this sort of standalone great example of using Twitter in the place, he went to the Prime Minister, is very careful, and I understand all that, but that's the example of somebody like going out on a ledge here. That's shocking to me. I mean, when you talk about the usage-based billing or rebuilding of the Liberal Party, why are they not taking Twitter names, and why are they not building up that database? Why are they not getting those communities going? And for the Liberal Party especially, you'd think this would be the brilliant time to do that. Micropayments, get all the debates going about the issues that Liberals now will probably feel alienated about now that they're caught in between. So I find it really amazing with that usage-based billing, especially that there was this huge explosion in the Twitterverse and then it died down. Like, why didn't somebody capture that audience in the political sphere and run with it and use it for political capital?
Let me put that to Mika, because you wrote a book describing Barack Obama's online success. You wrote, "It's not Facebook, it's the data, stupid."
Yes.
A playoff on Clinton's "It's the economy, stupid." Right. What do you mean by that?
Well, right now in the U.S., the chatter among the political class is that Facebook is the platform where you have to be for 2012. We're seeing town hall meetings held on Facebook. We're seeing presidential candidates announce their campaigns on Facebook. And I think this is a bit of a fad, and in many ways, it's our political journalists who don't really understand the internet or tech and politics very well.
So what's the data that you're referring to?
Well, what I mean is that what's really going to matter in U.S. politics in 2012 is how well the presidential campaigns target voters using data. And that, I mean, this is a double-edged sword, but the fact is that right now, whenever you use any of these tools, you're leaving all this information about yourself out there and available, and the campaigns are getting smarter and smarter about targeting you around what your very personal interests and proclivities are. They always used to do this with direct mail and commercial marketing, but now, for example, if I don't just like Barack Obama on Facebook, but download his Facebook app, now he has access to my entire social graph. He knows my friends, he knows their likes, he can inject information into my news feed to reach my friends. These are very, very powerful tools.
I want to follow up with Tony on this because, the Conservatives, I think, were pretty successful in this last election campaign at micro-targeting the audience they wanted to get to. We have this tax credit for left-handed people who live in cities that end with Q, who want to join
that was not on our
who
platform.
want to join gymnasiums. I'm pretty sure that tax credit was in there somewhere. Anyway, can you say now that it's all said and done whether or not that kind of micro-targeting was assisted by social media?
I think at the very early stages, typically Canadian political strategies and tactics are a couple of years or 3 years behind the Americans. So you will see that in the Canadian context, probably in the next go-round. There's no question about it. But I think we're also missing, if I may be so bold, we're missing a little bit of a point, which is we've been debating how this changes the ability of the voters to have this direct engagement. Yeah. But I think it also changes the politician. And I will say this, since I've been engaged in social media and using Twitter, that whole barrier between me as an elected representative, as a cabinet minister, and everyone else has completely dissolved. Because when people email a cabinet minister, I would find out about those emails a week, 2 weeks, later on when I have to start signing the letters to respond to the emails or approve the email response or whatever the response is. Now it's just so immediate. Like when I know when there's something controversial happening, and you mentioned the internet pricing, Jesse, that was a case in point. We had 500,000, Tony Clement had 500,000 emails, and I eventually learned that, but I had 5,000 tweets that went directly to me. And so I knew before my department knew, before my prime minister knew, before anyone else knew, all my advisors, I knew there was an issue. And that, for a cabinet minister, for a politician, that's critically important.
Well, there's one more element. I totally agree with you. But if people are tweeting at you, we know too, right?
Absolutely.
So in the old days, those 5,000 emails reaching you, you'd know maybe something's bubbling, but we don't know, the press doesn't know, and so it's under the surface. The reason why I talk about the age of transparency is that when these kinds of communications are out on the open web where we can all see them and track them and see a hashtag is jumping or something like that, now we know you have an issue and we're waiting to see how you respond. It changes that dynamic too, and hopefully mostly in a healthy way.
Can I just finish the thought? The other thing that's interesting is when there's an issue and when the issue is important, and that might be completely disconnected from what the mainstream media thinks is important. So the mainstream media might be running off in some sort of direction, and people will come to me and say, oh my gosh, we've got an issue. And I say, actually, we don't have an issue. And the reason it's not an issue is because I'm not seeing it on Twitter. And it may be in the mainstream media, but the people are not responding to it as an
Charlie,
issue.
a quick word on this?
Well, what changes as well for politicians, whether you're using Facebook or Twitter, is that people who aren't necessarily engaged, people call my constituency office because they're upset about something. People might write me an email. People on Facebook might just say, hey, I just got to send him a note, just see what he thinks. And I'm responding to my constituents 8, 10, 12 times a day directly. because I'm sitting at the airport, I check my Facebook page, someone sent me a note or someone's written a comment. That kind of connectivity has never been possible before, but it's drawing people into politics who wouldn't call the constituency office or write a letter or be politically active. They're killing time on Facebook. They go check out my page and say, whoa, I didn't know that, or hey, that's kind of weird. So they are expecting us to be accountable to them, and that's the game changer is our connection to them.
Question from the floor here. Hi.
Yeah, I have a question for Charlie, but I just want to start by thanking Tony for responding to my whiny tweets about usage-based billing at some point. Over the last 4 to 5 months, I've become a massive NDP supporter, predominantly because of a lot of discussions I've had, especially on fiscal policy, on Twitter and Facebook. So to me, when you say conversations on Twitter are essentially a whole bunch of mindless drivel, it's A, offensive. B, I want to understand what the NDP is really doing to understand if there is some sort of a grassroots movement that's brewing for your political party and how you can really take advantage of that.
Well, that's an excellent question. And when I say that, again, I'm going back to what I said about how politicians are using it. And I keep reiterating, I think a lot of politicians use Twitter in a way that's absolutely moronic. If that's offensive, that's totally cool by me. I think the important thing is the engagement. So we did a Twitter town hall on usage-based billing because people wanted to get involved, and the simplest way actually was to do it through Twitter. So that is a powerful thing. We couldn't do that before, where you got everybody in Canada can go on at the same time. So those engagements are really important, and we see things starting to brew. And the corollary of what Tony said is we know when there's a big issue that the national media might not know, because with the usage-based billing, we were hearing it and we could see this storm coming, and it wasn't in the editorial pages because they weren't connected the way we were connected. So this is the kind of engagement that we have to have. But we also have to have a good, honest discussion, because as much as social media gives us a lot, it's also, we've got a challenge, I think, to make it better, because 140 characters can be profound or it can be as dumb as you can get.
Okay, back
so
here,
how do we keep pushing ourselves to get that conversation happening is the big issue.
Follow-up question back here, please.
So I think one of the things that's been missing from these comments so far is that Twitter, Facebook, blogs, websites all serve a different purpose. So yesterday at one of the sessions here at MESH, someone from the Canadian Red Cross was talking about the response to the Japanese earthquake on social media, and how in the different stages of disaster relief, at first it was Twitter, everyone was spreading the news. Then they noticed it migrated to Facebook, where people were sharing things with their friends, digging a bit deeper. And then they noticed activity on people's blogs, where they were digging in depth and covering particular angles or particular issues. So Twitter's the real-time spread, Facebook is more connecting to the social network. Blogs are digging in deeper. So I think there's a bit of a false dichotomy when it's either or. I think we need to figure out what they're good for and use them in conjunction.
Wilf, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. We see it, we run an online news site that does that exactly. People give ideas, and you see them bubble exactly that way. They bubble up on Twitter, and then they migrate to Facebook, and there's a really enriching experience, because the 140 characters obviously is limited, and it grows that way, and you do get so much more depth, and you can actually trace the arc of the conversation and the narrative.
Let's broaden, since our questioner has done it for us, broaden our discussion to beyond what happened here on the 2nd of May and in the 37 days before that to what we saw around the world. And this is what a man who I suspect very few people had heard of 6 months ago, but who now is almost a household name, Wael Ghonim, who was front and center in what happened in Egypt. He said, "This is the revolution of the youth of the internet, and now the revolution of all Egyptians." Okay, Jesse, get us started on this. How central was the internet in the Arab Spring that we saw just a few months ago?
How central was it? I mean, the internet didn't do anything. The people did something, but they did it with the internet. And there seems to be this false discussion that is having is, well, did the internet do that or did the people do it? I don't think anyone with any legitimacy is actually suggesting that this happened by virtue of Facebook existing or Twitter existing. What did happen is this tool that allows people to organize, and there's some debate about how much it was used to organize, and some people disparage and say, well, it might have gotten the word out, but it didn't help to organize. That's enough. If it helped to get the word out, if the entire globe pays witness to something, which is what happened during the Arab Spring, that has a political effect. And I don't think that there's any debate whatsoever that that's what happened. We all watched that happen in real time, and many of us were part of that conversation as it was happening.
I think it was the speed. I mean, that's what's the difference here, is the speed at which all of this happened and the way it was covered too from the journalist's point of view. I mean, you look at a lot of the way the journalists were using Twitter. There was a curation aspect. There was journalists watching other journalists, seeing where things bubbled up, racing to the story. People back in their big newsrooms were seeing things happen right away, and they could respond to that. So I think Jesse's exactly right, but it's the speed at which all of this happened, and us getting the information, the people organizing and the people reporting, that's just never happened at that rate.
Let me give some equal time to the skeptics, though, and Malcolm Gladwell, who's from this province actually, had this to say in the New Yorker back in February. People protested and brought down governments before Facebook was invented. They did it before the internet came along. People with a grievance will always find ways to communicate with each other. How they choose to do it is less interesting in the end than why they were driven to do it in the first place. Tony Clement, let me start with you. 30 years ago, 10 million people in Poland of a population of 40 million joined Solidarity.
Right.
There was no Facebook.
Right.
Are we overrating the importance of these tools in what's gone on this year?
Well, I think the point here is that the medium isn't the message, but it certainly is the way in which people, in particular young people, tend to want to organize their thoughts and communicate their messages. So it has a centrality that way. The other thing that Malcolm Gladwell was saying, though, which I found particularly offensive, was he basically called a whole generation of young people the Slackerverse. This was in effect supplanting true political mobilization, because they could join a Facebook page and feel good about themselves, and that's all that they were doing. And I think that that's actually quite cynical and inaccurate. So I would like to vote against that point of view.
Mika, you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I think we should go back to something in Waelgonium's quote. He talked about the youth of the internet, right? And I think there is something else going on here. I agree with Jesse. The internet doesn't organize revolutions, people do. But when you grow up interconnected in the ways that not just the net and Facebook and Twitter, but cell phones and texting, when you grow up in this mesh, if you will, we're at the mesh conference, I use the magic word, it changes how you think. It changes your expectations about what's possible and what should be permitted or not permitted. Egypt has this huge bulge of young people. It's a big demographic wave, and they've been living under government-controlled media for a very long time. And in just the last few years, everybody gets cell phones, they get connected, and they start using social networks as a safe place to have a lateral conversation. Once that kind of meshed culture develops, they do behave in a different way. And I think Malcolm Gladwell completely misunderstands the role of technology in how that has changed the culture in all these places.
But, I can tell you, I was at the Canadian University Press Conference this year, and I was at their dinner. It was a lot of fun, and the Twitter penetration must have been 100%. Like, you looked out on the crowd of these university students, and there was a blue screen in front of them, every single one. And I actually spoke there, and I looked at this, and what we did is we decided to trend something to see how quickly we could get something trending to the top. No problem, we got it up to number 3 with that group, and that wasn't a huge group, but it shows you the difference of those generations. So you're exactly right, and I think that's where we're going to see a huge change if we're talking about an election or another organization. It'll be different.
Charlie, Clay Shirky, I think, said it the most amazing about what the revolutionary potential is. The revolution doesn't happen when the tools are cool. It's when they become boring, when they become everyday, when you grow up with them. So did that cause the revolution? No, and if you say that, I think you're not showing the respect to what people were facing on the ground and their frustration. I mean, that grass was dry for years and years and years. But when it caught fire, there was a whole whack of people who were connected in ways they hadn't been before. And they hadn't set out to do something revolutionary. This was just what they did every day. But then they were starting to tell where things were happening, and then the outside world could watch. And that's, again, to use the term the game changer, that's what it is that this is so much a part of our lives, and it connects us in ways that weren't possible. So we could be bored with it, we could play games with it, but in a revolutionary moment, that potential will take down anybody.
Well, Jesse, let me do a little more comparing and contrasting here, because I want to find out how different is the kind of political organization that we see in this digital communication revolution from what came before it. Can we tell how it's different? You say we had Facebook, we didn't have Facebook in the past, but stuff still happened anyway.
You know, before we had cars, people still got to their destination. You know, what have cars done? They changed everything. This technology, it's been pointed out, okay, well, it's neutral, it could be used for good, it could be used for bad. I actually disagree with that. Let's think about the printing press. The printing press can be used for totalitarian means, it can be used for propaganda, for slander, you can say all sorts of nasty things and do all sorts of nasty things with the printing press. Was it a good thing for democracy when people started to read? Was it a good thing for democracy when people became able to write and to publish en masse to other people? That is a good thing for the public conversation. That is a good thing for our democracy. If now you put that printing press in the hands of anybody with real-time effects, that is inherently a good thing. It can be used for negative things. It's a good thing.
Let me ask Tony Clement about this then. When you're, and I'm not asking you to violate cabinet solidarity here or anything like that, but presumably when Egypt was exploding, the cabinet of this country was having discussions about how Canada ought to react. Who should we support? Should we support Mubarak? Should we get behind this thing? You have less time, I presume, in this era to make those decisions because with the help of these tools, things are quickly moving now. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think things always, we're always the product of our environment, so it's hard for me to judge how they reacted in the 1600s. The social media, people talking to one another in some way has always been around. Martin Luther nailing 95 theses onto the post was a form of social media in the broadest sense of the term. So it's always been with us, but the rapidity is there. And I cannot answer your question directly, but I would argue, and I would say this to my cabinet colleagues, if you are hooked into social media, you just get more information more quickly than your cabinet colleagues do.
Did you get better information?
That's always a question of judgment. I would say having more information and having the ability and the judgment to sift through that information ultimately gets you better decisions. And me as a cabinet minister, I can tell you 90% of the news information I get now, I derive from Twitter because people are pushing stories to me. People are pushing these breaking news items to me. I don't have to look around for them, wake up and say, gee, I wonder what's happening in Egypt today. People are telling me what's happening in Egypt today. So as a decision maker, that's critical.
Charlie?
The way this has changed everything is I work with one of my communities, kids in Attawapiskat who've been fighting to get a school, isolated community. 10 years ago you put out a press release, right? Well, a press release lasts for a day, someone might pick it up, maybe somebody would do a local story, and that's it. You dream that the media would fly up, but it's too expensive. So here's an isolated community with kids in pretty rotten conditions, and they use YouTube. And so YouTube isn't the evening news. YouTube is where kids are on all the time, and YouTube is constant. So here's a story that starts to break, and these kids use new media. It doesn't die. It's not part of a news cycle. It's there. So if it's a good story, it's always there. If it's a bad story, 10 people watch it and 3 like it and the rest ignore it. But when it starts to carry on and kids like it and then they link it, or adults, that's how social change can start to happen, because you can't really control that. The story doesn't die. It can continue to revolve as long as people see a legitimacy in the story. And I think that that's a much more revolutionary way of us being engaged and also changing things.
Question from the floor.
Hi, my name is Tom Purvis, T. Purvis on Twitter. Question is, when we think about changing society, who's winning in Canada when we have these optimistic messages from the Arab world about social media giving more voice to citizens? But in Canada, which side is being empowered more? Is it, we've heard this one example of, well, the data is great because it lets us market our message more effectively to voters. But as a citizen, I kind of want you to be more focused on creating good policy and being more transparent and accountable. And so I'm wondering, and as this is a business conference where we have equal numbers of marketers saying, how do we use social media to sell more stuff or sell messages versus, who's being more empowered? Us retail voters in terms of making you pick up your game and produce better policy, or you guys in being able to better compete against each other or drive messages that you've already come up with?
Let me get Jesse and Mika to start on that.
That's such a great question, because it almost feels like we've been talking about social media as if it's something that our politicians have anything to actually decide on. You know, like it exists whether or not they use it, it exists whether or not they like it, and it's part of politics, regardless of these things. The real goal here, again, is not that it's a campaign tool. The real goal here is that we engage in a way that is beyond really this blunt instrument that is the vote. I mean, I might agree with Tony that we need more competition in the telecom sphere. I might disagree with him that digital locks are a good thing, but I have only one thing I can do, which is I can vote, and I can't even vote for you. I can vote for your party or not. Is that really all I should be able to do as a citizen? I think that a lot of the disengagement that people have is that they want to do a lot more. We talk about people getting involved through the internet in relief efforts in Japan. We talk about people getting involved, you know, building apps that help out society. There's all kinds of things that if we redefine what is political engagement through the internet, Canadians are doing en masse. Again, it's just a phenomenon that I think our political culture and our politicians have yet to really capture or even catch up with.
Mika?
Yeah, well, very quickly, also, great question. You know, the technology, I think, is neutral. It will be used by incumbents, whether it's incumbent politicians or businesses, to maintain their position. And it will also be used by other people to try and disrupt and open up the conversation. I think the reason why I made the point about the power of data is that we as citizens have to get better informed. We have to become digitally literate about the kinds of information that we are inadvertently sharing and how marketers, political marketers or commercial marketers, may start to use it. We may need to push back a little bit on who actually controls that information. I don't think Facebook should necessarily control my social graph. I would like to control that data and decide who gets to use it. And so right now we're going through a big transition. I do expect campaigns like the Obama campaign in 2012 to push the envelope and show us how far you can go with micro-targeting. But then I think citizens may start to ask questions about whether they really like being manipulated in that way and whether that really is the purpose. So it's going to go back and forth.
Question from the floor.
How has social media, Twitter and Facebook, brought news to the people on a local level?
Huh. Who knows about that? How it brings it home on a local level? Go ahead, Charlie.
Well, you're the news guy, so maybe you should take it first.
Well, I found it amazing that there was even an effort by the political parties to court the papers in the editorial to try to get the editorial boards to think, and I just think that's absolutely useless. I mean, I don't even know, especially younger people, if they even bother to look at that as to guiding their decisions, where when you have the social networks out there for like Twitter. When it came to local news, I mean, for us and for what you see, and I don't know about your writing, but I did talk to some conservatives, and what they were doing was they just said, forget the big guys in the mainstream media. We're going to go to the local and the local ethnic press, and that's where we're going to target some of our energy and get our messages out.
But that's still mainstream media.
It's still mainstream media, but you know, my point is, you're seeing you're seeing it come down, right? So you used to be you had to go in, you know, in Canada even you had to go to the Toronto Star or the Globe Mail. I mean that's come down and down and down. Now it's Twitter and you know and the very local news.
There's something on the board here that says, do younger people care which party a newspaper endorses? We think they care a little.
Yeah, and I think there's a wink there. So we got to have a bit of a nod. I think they care. I don't think they care at all. I mean,
not a whole lot.
You know, not a whole lot.
Yeah. I think the definition of local has changed, though. I was trying to think about how to answer your question, and to me, yeah, I have hundreds. I have 16,000 followers on Twitter, so hundreds of them are from my riding, but many thousands of them are not. So my definition of local is very different. Yeah, I have a local community I'm responsible to. They're the people who hired me, and I respect them. Absolutely. But really what Twitter does and other social media does is slice and dice in very different ways. So your communities are very different. They're communities of interest, they're communities of debate, and communities of discussion.
Tony, let me follow up with you. Look at the very bottom of the screen there. It says, Tony's getting 90% of his news from Twitter. I'm guessing Twitter links to the mainstream media.
No.
That's not the same thing.
No, that isn't how I do it.
Let's clarify.
Because yeah, I get mainstream media links, there's no question about that. But I make a point. I have 16,000 followers. I follow 15,000 people. And they are most definitely not necessarily of my political persuasion. Some of them are, I'm glad to say, but a lot of them aren't. And so when I say people are pushing stories and ideas to me, it's coming from the whole range. Not just from the microcosm of conservatism.
Are there any people who have said to you, You've got 15,000 people following you, and you're following 15,000 others. Is this a sensible use of a cabinet minister's time?
Well, I didn't say I read every single one of them, but no. But obviously it's a point in time. If I have a spare minute, you just you click on, and whoever's got the last 150 tweets, those are the 150 tweets I'll be reading.
Gotcha.
But if something is of value and is catching hold, it'll be retweeted. So even if it was tweeted an hour ago, it'll be retweeted by someone that I know or that
There are
I'm
also
following.
tools for aggregating, so you can see what sorts of things
Steve,
are hot.
I think the issue that we, in the end, have to go back to, because as politicians, we're sort of here talking about how we either ride the wave or we get washed under by the wave. But it should be, what are we doing to establish this digital realm of conversation? Because we are either going to be digital consumers or we're going to be digital citizens. And that is a crucial policy decision that is being made at government level right now. And I'm really concerned that there's a concerted effort to basically turn us back into digital consumers. So yeah, we can waste a lot of our time in little mobile walled gardens when our privacy rights as citizens are being sucked up by whatever company is pretending to be our media friend. Meanwhile, our right to establish interconnectedness on the internet is based, net neutrality is a huge thing. The ability to access high speed anywhere in rural and northern or urban Canada, because this is to be part of a digital citizen. But what are the rights of a digital citizen so that we can participate and we can engage? And if we want to engage in politics, great, but if we want to engage in social activities or whatever else, those are the rights of the digital citizen. And I think that that's what this Parliament, and this is where Canada needs to take the political discussion.
Let me follow up on that. Mika, with you on this. This technology makes it obviously much easier for like-minded people to galvanize support around a particular issue. In the old days, if you wanted to do that, you probably had to, more often than not, join a political party. Does this threaten the traditional political party structure?
Absolutely. I think the political parties to some degree are, like Wile E. Coyote, off the cliff, still running as if there's something underneath them, and there isn't. And to Jesse's point, we have the ability now to create extra political movements that don't have to work through the party structures to push an issue onto the national stage, and then the question is whether the political system responds or not. So there's room for new kinds of political organization here. And I don't expect the parties to go away, though, because they still control the levers of power. They write the laws about how people get elected. They will do things to preserve their position to some degree arbitrarily, and in other ways they'll adapt, and they'll figure out how to, the same way every other mass media that's come along has been embraced. One party figures out how to use it to their advantage, everybody else copies them.
Jesse?
Well, it's a great point, and here actually is an area where Canada can lead, because we don't have the same dyed-in-the-wool political culture where, my grandfather was a Democrat, so I'm a Democrat. We don't care about your parties that much. And we care about our issues, and the idea to me that because I care about one issue, I have to then accept all these other ones, I think that's obsolete. We're post-partisan now, and to Tony's point, it's absolutely true. The internet is very disrespectful to geography and these sort of psychographics that it creates. There's an instant community based on people who care about usage-based billing, an instant community that's formed like that. You don't have to pay union dues. You don't have to worry about the corruption of leadership. You join a Facebook group, and that group exists. And unlike how you and I operate as journalists, we get people really excited about a topic for a short period of time, we move on to the next one. If those people opt into that group, they are now a political force that has to be respected. If you want their votes, you want to bring them under your tent, you've got to somehow come and offer them something and negotiate with them, and people can be a member of as many of these groups as they want to. It's a real opportunity here if we can reform how we think of how politics works and how these associations work.
Tony, we did see a few years ago in the province of Ontario, 100,000 young people joined a Facebook page saying, Premier McGuinty, we don't like the changes you're making to the driver's license requirements, and the Premier stood down. That's one example, I guess, Premier, the best example in the last few years of a bunch of people getting around an issue to affect change. But at the risk of torturing a metaphor, we heard a lot about big blue tents and big red tents in the last federal election. We've tended to do politics, I guess, in this country and in the United States in bigger tents. If this affects the size of the tents, we've got a bunch of little tents now being created, how's that going to change our politics going forward?
Well, I do think that we still rely on our political parties to be the aggregators of various issues and ideas, and of course we all have our different points of view. So Charlie and I may agree that being citizens on the internet is important to the future of our democracy and society, but we may disagree on how to get there or how to protect those rights. So, and that's all fine. That's all fine in a political context. So you do need the political parties to aggregate those ideas and to set them off so that people can have a choice. But I think for the last, when I was a political science student back in the early 80s in university, we were talking about how political parties were dead and buried and were not relevant anymore because people were joining Greenpeace or some other pressure group. So that's been the reality for political parties in the post-war period. It's nothing new, but they're still there. And they still are how you win elections.
And I don't think that we're going to get all these small tents. I actually think the exciting thing that's happened is people organize themselves, and then they might politically opt in at a certain point as a whole whack of people who are very concerned about something. For example, one of the previous copyright bills, that was a firestorm. People got engaged. Now, did they suddenly get bored? Not your bill, not your bill, the previous one, Tony. But did they get bored? I don't think so. They changed the tent.
Well,
they changed how the tent looked. And then but they're still there.
But let me give you another example. There was a significant campaign, actual and virtual, to get Omar Khadr out of jail. Didn't happen. Didn't go anywhere.
We kept it in the news.
You kept it in the news, but at the end of the day, you didn't get the change in policy you wanted.
Well, but again, you know, liking something on Facebook doesn't make it happen.
Right.
And it doesn't get you elected. And being the best, I know some candidates who spent a lot of time on Twitter and didn't get elected, and I know some who never went on Facebook and did get elected. You got to door knock.
Most of them are your caucus.
You got to door knock. You got to door knock. You got to get out. You have to have something that's sellable. And if social media helps you, then that's great. But and it's going to change it. But it's again, we just can't break it down to one or the other.
Go ahead, Meade. Down to our last minute here, guys.
Sure. In the United States, we say the holy grail here is figuring out how you move online enthusiasm to real-world activism. And people are doing that every day. But there is this fascination with the shiny new thing, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, and it's a mistake to just think that numbers there, even the tweets you're getting at you, automatically can be counted as votes or counted as people willing to sit down in the street and commit civil disobedience. There are other ways of amassing power. What's new is that the ability to organize and to have a voice is now in the hands of everybody. Yeah. We don't have to wait for politicians to do things. We can do them ourselves. And what we do with that is the question for the future.
And I'm going to give our friend from south of the border the last word on this program. I want to thank all 5 of you for coming here. You've barely touched your blackberries in the last hour, which is probably the longest any of you have gone without doing it. So reach now if you like, tweet away on how wonderful the experience was being on TVO. I thank you for being here on today's program. I want to thank the audience for joining us as well here at the MESH conference.